Louise. Well, I'm interviewing you and making a little video because you've been doing some quite intensive work looking after people who appear to have been unjustly treated by Sydney Anglican diocese, and in response some of the diocesan people seem to have been putting around very uncharitable and untrue things about you. So let's set the record straight a bit. Now, you weren't brought up as an Anglican, were you?
No, I was actually brought up as a Seventh-day Adventist, but my parents left the church when I was in my early teens, and for a while I was content just not to be attending church, and in fact spent quite a number of years basically rejecting a Christian life until I was brought into a reconversion.
Okay, well tell us how that happened.
Well, that was very strange. I was under a lot of pressure, and I just started basically calling for help. I didn't have any sense of calling any particular person, but I needed help. I knew that. And that help was offered to me in the most extraordinary and intimately personal way, a personal response that simply turned my life around. Mind you, it wasn't offered without conditions, and the condition was ultimately of complete loving obedience to God because of his revelation to me of himself. And that just turned my life around.
Okay, I want to move on a little bit. Now, you'd always been keen on music and had done well on piano, but then you took a lot of pains to learn the organ and church music, and you were organist and choir master for a number of Anglican parishes. Can you tell us a little bit about your work there?
Yeah, I was the most reluctant organist ever, really, dragged into playing the pipe organ. The pipe organ is the most terribly difficult and unforgiving instrument, I think, that was ever devised by mankind. And I did not want to play it. Although I loved the music of Bach, I really thought I didn't like organ music particularly. And so when God made it very clear to me that he wanted me to learn the pipe organ, and then put in my way someone who could advise me as to where to go to learn and from whom to learn, I really, really did not want to do it. However, you can't refuse God. If you want to have the benefits of a relationship with him, then you can't refuse him. And I was sent to this wonderful teacher, Robert Smith, who was then the organist and choir director at St Thomas's, North Sydney, and started learning to play. After about 6 months of trying to coordinate hands and feet, it would take, after about half an hour, I'd be, knock-kneed and cross-eyed, trying to play this instrument. I gradually started to improve, and then I had to tackle stage fright. I'd always had performance nerves. And so that was another aspect that I needed a great deal of help from God for. But however, I started learning and then started doing the examinations, and then the specific courses in church music, including one run part-time over 4 years through the Conservatorium of Music by David Rumsey, which nearly killed me because I was still in full-time practice as a solicitor. And I not only had to learn and demonstrate competence in the pipe organ as my first instrument of choice, I then had to have a second instrument of choice, which I dallied with the harpsichord but ended up sticking to the piano. And it was such an intense time. We were also taught choral conducting and the history of church music, many other fascinating and wonderful things. But then I started just doing simple work for minor services, and gradually was invited to play for other parishes. including St James Turramurra and All Saints Hunters Hill, was an incredibly difficult time because of the pressure of running the music programs, including training choirs. I look back and wonder how I actually managed to survive. On the other hand, I had the greatest pleasure of playing for weddings and sitting there while the couple went through their vows, wondering why the bridesmaids had allowed themselves to be put in that particular colour. And it was a time of fun as well. I also learnt about the extraordinary dynamics of church choirs, and I also learnt about what it was like to work for clergy of great sincerity who had no idea what music was all about.
Okay, now, so would I be right in saying that you describe yourself as an Anglican by choice or conviction?
I'm an Anglican by adoption. I decided to be an Anglican because you, my brother, had become an Anglican. And my mother suggested we should start going to church, and we started going to St Swithin's Pymble when that wonderful clergyman Clive Cole was there. And St Swithin's at that stage was a church where there was a great deal of spiritual control, good spiritual control over what was happening.
Yes, I remember both Bishop and Helen Curl as being wonderful people of God and very powerful people of prayer.
Yes, yes, and I would notice when he was not there, but when he was there, whatever was being said up front, he was there, sitting there, deep in prayer.
So to answer one criticism that seems to have been made of you, you were not interested in tearing down the Anglican Church, but rather warning it for its own good so that it may be built up. Would that be right?
Absolutely. It is a matter of great and grave concern when you have people in positions of authority who abuse that authority, whether we found it through sexual abuse of children, tremendous abuse, but that's not the only sort of abuse. And I've been dealing with people who have been falsely accused of these things. Where has been the Christian charity? Where has been actually intelligence and fairness, the concepts of the rule of law that all have their foundations in our Christian faith, but are simply ignored, ridden roughshod over? Anglican Church, particularly in Sydney diocese, because that's what I've been looking at, in their processes. You can't allow that. You can't allow people, and in one case, children, to be thrown out of church because of this lack of Christian concern, a lack of a Christian response. Some of the cases have been very shocking, and in one that I'm thinking of 10 years later, such is the post-traumatic stress disorder that some of the family have suffered, that they are already collapsing again once the case is raised again.
Yes, it particularly perplexed me, with the very serious thing of clergy sex abuse, which has been very much in the media, but also in this sort of bullying and hierarchy's response to it, that they did not seem to have read their Bibles, and seen what God did to the Ark of His Covenant when they misused it, or what He did to His sanctuary at Shiloh when they did not act out in His character, and indeed what He did to both temples in Jerusalem. I suppose what Jesus said in His letters to the churches, these 7 churches, if you do not repent, I will remove your lamp from its lampstand, so that we serve a God who has a moral character and is much more interested in us imitating and honouring His moral character than being I'm going to say, organisation people who think that they can run an organisation that does not honour God, so that really the ones who put up with this sort of abuse are the ones who are tearing the church down and almost daring God to, smite it aside, and it's the ones who, well, prophet-like. I mean, Jesus said, I will send to them messengers, some of whom they'll reject and some of whom they'll stone. The ones that are sent to them to show them they're doing something wrong and urge them to repent. Anyway, sorry, I'm getting off on a sermon. Let me come back to the story and ask you again to talk. Tell us how you became involved in this, well, like I say, dispute resolution, but really in the problems in the church, in dispute resolution.
Well, it goes back to the mid-1990s, just seeing the destructive effect of a small clique of practitioners in two very different parishes attacking their clergymen.
So you mean St Luke's, Vermont in Victoria, and St Swithin's, Pymble in New South Wales.
In New South Wales. And seeing the way in which they captured power and then twisted the tail of the diocesan officials in a totally unchristian response. In both cases with clergymen who were totally innocent of any wrongdoing. However, I didn't necessarily think that anything would come from that. Then I was
So really a little while after those things, in fact, a few years after those things, you were approached. Tell us about that.
We're getting to quite a few years, well, not quite a few, but a few years later, people that I knew in the congregation of the church I was then attending approached me about the case of a man who'd been falsely accused of an immoral and adulterous relationship. And the way in which this was taken up by the Professional Standards Unit of Sydney Diocese with absolutely no evidence.
Am I right thinking in that one that one of his accusers said, I really have no evidence, but I really believe that he did it?
Yes, we were at the... those were the early stages of this politically correct, left-wing, progressive sort of thing where the truth doesn't matter, it's a matter of how you feel it or how you perceive it, and that is totally wrong. The church has a legal system of its own that, in the cases I've been looking at, the organisational people have decided that they will apply it or not, as it suits their particular agenda. You can't have that sort of behaviour, and that actually it victimises people, but what's more, it demonstrates a complete contempt for the character of God.
Well, yes, he said, acquitting the guilty and convicting the innocent, I hate them both.
Yes.
Yes, right throughout, or particularly in the Old Testament, you see God very keen on the proper judicial process. And someone like Ahab, who, his wife arranged a judicial murder, God really punished most severely. So, yes, in the church, we above all should have all due process. Now, after that, somebody else approached you, did they?
Yes, I had this phone call, and I was in my office at the university. I'd moved on to teaching law at that stage, and it was almost a miracle I was there to take the phone call. And it was from a young man who asked me whether it was lawful for a church to actually ban young people from coming to church. And I was so astonished because I said I thought the church wanted young people to come to church. And he cross-examined me about my association, if any, with Sydney Diocese of the Anglican Church. And having assured him that I was independent of any of their committees and so on, he told me how his whole family of 6 children, going back as young as 10, had been banned from going to the church. And I said, I can't imagine. What on earth did you do? piss in the sanctuary or something like that, and which made him laugh a bit. But in fact, this was an enormous tragedy that had been inflicted upon these children and the wife of a man who'd been accused of creating a sexual relationship with a young woman, who, apart from her mental and physical problems, had not actually had any sort of sexual relationship with him, nor indeed anyone, by the time she was 20 and 21, making these false accusations. In fairness to her, I have to say, she was the pawn of other people.
Yes, you deal with that a lot in A Mother's Story and Evolution of a Lie, that
And
really this was a terrible, well, not a judicial murder, but an abuse of the judicial process or the disciplinary process of the church to try and silence a whistleblower, and really to punish a family that certain people were in the parish were jealous of, would you say?
It's very, very shocking. It's very shocking, the jealousy and the malice that came out, particularly when we got our hands on the actual interviews that these people gave to the diocesan investigator. And it was very shocking for the older children and the husband and wife to read what the senior minister's wife really thought about them, and what the senior minister thought about them, and what the executive minister thought about them. And the lies that had been told about them and spread right through the area, the district in which they lived. These people deliberately going to other Christian churches to warn them off from offering any sort
From a 10-year-old or 11-year-old to going there.
Going there, yes.
Yes, this does seem to have been a very dysfunctional parish.
It was a cult.
Yes, I mean, as I think I said to you, if I had done that to children, I would have expected to, in fact, be on trial myself before a diocesan tribunal for, spiritual and emotional abuse and bullying of children.
Oh, well, of course we did complain about that.
And what was done to your complaints? Were the clergy disciplined?
They were sat on, of course, until...
The clergy or the complaint?
They don't sit on the clergy, but they sat on the complaint until there was a change of PSU, Professional Standard Unit Director. And then it was dismissed as lacking evidence and misconceived.
So really, they were prepared to misuse their procedures, I can say, to achieve an unlawful and immoral end of silencing a whistleblower, but they were not prepared to deal with genuine abuse by clergy and people in power.
Absolutely.
Yes, well, that is a pretty terrible thing indeed. And you've spent a lot of work on this. But, all right, in your work, although obviously it must have made you very angry to come across such wicked behaviour, is your hope for the good or for the destruction of the diocese?
Oh, for the good. Look, we're facing a time that would have been inconceivable when I was a young woman, that Christianity would be under attack, that the whole basis of our civilization, therefore, is under attack. And the Christian Church has allowed Satan to have a tremendous victory in the eyes of the community because of the child sex abuse and all the cover-ups and the bullying that went on with that. And with these cases as well, there are now forces very strongly moving in Australian society that would stamp out all Christianity. Therefore, the churches need to be clean and cleansed of all these terrible things. It needs to be totally renovated, rejuvenated. My belief, very firmly, is until the church does this, we are delaying the renovation and rejuvenation of the church and the revival that is going to be absolutely necessary to pull Australia back from the brink of absolute spiritual disaster.
Thank you, Louise.
Thank you.